And joining me now is Harland Ullman. He's the chairman of the Killowen Group and senior advisor of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Harland, thank you again for joining us. Now, what was your take on the defence minister's speech?
I don't think this was anything out of the ordinary, and I think the most important thing that came out of this IISS conference at Shangri La was the off-site meeting that Secretary Austin and General Wei had, in which General Wei agreed, I think, to having more dialogue at all different levels between the United States and the PRC. I think that was significant. About for the comments that you referenced in terms of General Wei's toughness, I went to China first 35 years ago, and quite frankly, the tone may have changed a little bit, but the passion over Taiwan has not. And so I thought that these comments, yeah, they were tough, but I don't think they reflected any kind of change in terms of Chinese policy nor an American policy. I think the situation may actually have improved a little bit if these dialogues are going to continue at the highest levels between Washington and Beijing.
Perhaps the toughest words that Wei used were a path to death if Taiwan was to declare independence from China. You say that the policy hasn't changed, the language perhaps has. What do you think this message sends to the West?
I don't think it sends much of a message. I think people already understand that. And I think that what a lot of people in the West really believe is that the United States and China need a closer dialogue. One of the areas that I have argued for a long time is that the United States ought to be thinking about and actually lifting the tariffs that were imposed by the Trump administration on China. Those tariffs, I think, were for the wrong reason, but I think they're doing more damage to the American consumer. There needs to be progress between the relations of China and the United States. Both sides don't improve simply by threatening the other side. Both are major countries. Much of the world economy depends upon both. And the least hostile and the more improved those relations can be, I think it's better for not only Asia, but the world at large. And I think we ought to be moving in that direction.
It's interesting you say that because, I wonder if Wei was in fact being very careful about his language in his speech. One interesting thing I noticed was when talking about the threat to China-Taiwan reunification, Wei didn't actually single out the US, instead used the interference of external forces, for example, or just some countries. Is this a strategy, do you think, by China to try and keep the tone or keep the heat between both sides down?
I think so. I think China is sending a signal. Sometimes it's very difficult for us to read Chinese signals, which we see as ambiguous, and I'm sure the same applies to China regarding the United States. But I certainly would be trying to improve relations through greater dialogue. I think military-to-military dialogue is more sensible because both militaries are professional. Nobody wants to have some kind of incident at sea, in the air, where there's some kind of a mistake or mishap. Remember in 2001, the Chinese happened to knock down a U.S. Patrol plane over one of its largest islands. And fortunately, because the relationships were pretty good, that ended what could have been a very bad situation. If that were to happen again and a U.S. Navy plane were knocked down over Hainan, I don't think it would be resolved as easily or as quickly. So the more that the U.S. and the Chinese sides can discuss, starting at the military level, I think the less the tensions will grow. And I think that's very important because it's not in Washington or Beijing's interest to have these hostile relationships and another Cold War break out. What does it do for both parties? Not very much.
Not surprising, of course, that Taiwan did dominate the conversation between the ministers, but reports say that the two ministers also discussed the conflict in Ukraine. China assuring the US that it hasn't and won't supply any weapons to Russia. Has China's position changed or developed since the conflict in Ukraine began, do you think?
No, I think that President Xi is somewhat embarrassed, at the very least, of what's happening in Ukraine. It's clear, I'm sure, to Beijing, that Russia is the aggressor, Russia is imposing war crimes, and Russia is destroying a sovereign country. Now, of course, there's a contradiction here, because China and Russia are seemingly allied at some levels. But I don't think this is so much a change. I think it's a difference in rhetoric. But I think the Chinese fully understand what Russia is doing is wrong, and they need to navigate a very careful path between maintaining the relationship but not embarrassing their so-called ally. Though the United States should move on that, because China could be an interlocutor, perhaps, to try to end the war, at least produce some kind of ceasefire, and certainly to help, I think, negotiate the release of so much grain and wheat from Odessa that's necessary to prevent a huge starvation crisis that can affect hundreds of millions, if not billions of people globally, and that's certainly going to affect China.